Forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out this morning. I thought to get started and put into context what I'm going to talk about, it might make sense to tell you a little bit about my background, because this question of personalization has been a personal obsession for me for almost 30 years. I was fortunate enough to go to Princeton and to Harvard Business School and then joined Johnson & Johnson. And I had the chance to run the Tylenol brand and before that the Band-Aid brand. And as a consumer marketer, you learn very early that an obsession over what drives the consumer, what drives brand choice, what drives category usage, or as I left Johnson & Johnson and then joined a consulting firm briefly, I try to label this question the why question. Why do consumers do what they do? So I had the chance to then take that why question into financial services briefly before starting a marketing services company called Rosetta. And Rosetta built a technology, a piece of intellectual property that really unpacked this why question in something we call personality-based segmentation. And I'm going to show you a brief, high-level, stylized case study of that in the context of personalization in health tech. So thanks to many of you in the audience here and our colleagues around the industry, I think it would be fair to say that health tech is truly at a Copernican revolution. For those of you who are history majors, as I was, or have a curiosity about how science has developed, you may remember that Copernicus was the 16th century dude who said, hey, you Greek guys have it all wrong. In fact, it's not the Earth that is the center of the universe, it's actually the sun. And in fact, rather than having the planets revolve around the Earth, the planets in our solar system actually revolve around the sun. So I like to think about this in our context and think that in the past, we thought about healthcare as the doctor as the center of the universe, or perhaps insurance companies as the center of the universe. And the rest of us, particularly as patients and consumers, revolved around this fixed position. What has now happened as a result of health tech, as a result of really the digital revolution, is in fact the consumer or the patient is in the center. And now hospitals and doctors and insurance companies and employers all need to figure out how to serve that central source of decision making. So again, as a history major, I find it kind of interesting to think about other digital environments, other digital domains where perhaps a similar kind of evolution has occurred. So we think about search engines, we think about social networks, and we think about web browsers. And as you can see in this very stylized view, in the beginning, there were many, many, many competitors. And we call that infancy. And then as these categories evolved, perhaps into puberty, the next key step was a race to product market fit and to begin to optimize the personal experience. And just taking Google, who's that big green dot, not exactly labeled, but imagined, it's remarkable what Google did, right? Google continues to enhance the customer experience by predicting searches, by actually caching the content in geographies where they know a set of searches will occur to further accelerate the speed with which you hit your return button and the information returns. So a march toward personalization has been one of the key characteristics of this race from many little dots to a few large dots. And I would imagine there are people in the room who are trying to figure out, how do I become one of those large dots? So one way of thinking about this is that the digital domain actually has a fewer number of degrees of freedom. So let's take search engines as an example. The product feature, make it fast. The user experience, make it simple. Distribution, use the internet. Now, I have a lot of appreciation for the miracles of what Facebook and Google and others have done. I realize that their task is far more complex than that. But I would argue, as many people do when they talk about healthcare, that healthcare is fundamentally different. It has so many more dimensions to it, dimensions of complexity that make this march toward personalization all the more challenging. So I thought I might take a few minutes before we bring the panel up to show you something that we've done, and that we here as my former firm, Rosetta, really just to put out there the possibility of how personalization might work in health tech. So this is a bit of a stylized case study. It's also a bit dated, but it'll give you a sense of what we've come to believe is the march toward personalization in health tech. So this particular category is cosmetic surgery, and the marketers, the product designers, the engineers, the people who happen to work for this company looked at the cosmetic surgery market initially something like this. They asked the question who, as most good commercially focused folks do, and the answer to who for cosmetic surgery comes back just as you would anticipate. Very intuitive, right? Mostly women, not entirely. There are men who actually have cosmetic surgery. Women typically 35 to 55, above average household income, and they tend to have kids, 1 to 2 kids. As we continue to append data to these consumers through all kinds of sources of household level data, we begin to add an understanding from who to what. So we begin to understand where the target consumer might live, perhaps the suburbs, what she might do in terms of exercise, perhaps what her purchases look like in an adjacent category like cosmetics, and again, her household composition. So this is what she looks like in the beginning of the march toward personalization. Fairly unnuanced, fairly intuitive. I probably didn't tell you anything you don't already know if you said now you have to go build a product and a customer experience for cosmetic surgery. There's a fundamental dimension that's missing with the who and the what. And what I became very interested in at Johnson & Johnson and then built a company around is really answering the why question. Fundamentally, why does she consider and ultimately make the decision to have cosmetic surgery? And what we figured out over about a 15-year period is that you can actually answer this question at scale. That as consumers of any category, we are an intersection of 3 key elements: our needs, emotional and rational needs, our attitudes toward the category. How do I feel about doctors? How do I feel about my self-image? Do I believe that I can have an impact on my health? How do I feel about pharmaceutical solutions? How do I feel about hospitals and insurance companies? And then behaviors. What do I actually do? What are my purchase behaviors? What are my behaviors throughout my week? So what we figured out how to do is to create a segmentation system that identifies consumers as the intersection of these 3 dimensions: their needs, their attitudes, and their behaviors. And we were able to take this data and model it in a certain way such that we could then build a predictive tool, either using questions or using algorithms off household level data, to actually predict who is in each one of these segments. And this fundamentally begins to change the game in personalization, because now you can answer the question why. You can answer the questions such as, why do they care about being beautiful? Whom do they want to look beautiful for? And things like what drives their self-esteem. These are a much more nuanced level of understanding of the why question and therefore the target, and I believe ultimately will be the keys to unlocking personalization in healthcare. So let's play with this a little further. Let's imagine this first group who answers the why question by saying, look, I want to look as good as I possibly can for my age, but I don't want to look done. That was a word we heard women use. In fact, in focus groups, they would put their hands up against their face and mimic what some Hollywood stars look like after they've had their 8th facelift. They did not want to look artificial, but rather they wanted to look the very best they could for their age. And the people who validated whether they looked great or not were not actually men, but were their friends. So when their friends said, "You look terrific today," that was the point of validation. Then there was another group. There was another group that actually was obsessed about looking the very best they could. Their age had nothing to do with it. And in fact, their point of validation was men. They felt best when a man gave them a compliment saying, "You really look terrific," or maybe something a little less proper than that. So what we found was that there were two very, very different mindsets. We call them personalities. So again, putting this in the context of the evolution of personalization in health tech, in the early stages, that stage where there were all those tiny little balls in the digital domains, we had this level of understanding of the consumer. And just to put a name and a face on her, for those of you who like the TV show Mad Men, perhaps she was Betty Draper, Don Draper's wife. We had a kind of single or a few-dimensional understanding of what she was really about. We then, with personality-based segmentation, began to understand more dimension about who really wanted this cosmetic surgery. And perhaps Katie Couric is an archetype of that second personality. She doesn't want to be done, and she wants to look great for her girlfriends. And then, just playing a little bit with popular culture and TV shows, perhaps Samantha Jones from Sex and the City was the archetype for this woman who wanted to look absolutely the best she could possibly look, younger and sexier, and specifically the point of validation was men. So this is all kind of interesting. It almost sounds like an anthropological study. So who cares? What does this actually have to do with personalization and commercializing successful businesses in health tech? What we were able to do was then begin to change the way we targeted and tailored all of the communication. This happens to be the first page of a website. And what would happen when you visited this brand's website was you were asked 2 questions on a 7-point scale. And with 2 questions, we could predict whether you were Katie Couric or Samantha Jones to about 75% accuracy. And based on who you were, we could then provide much more relevant communication. So you see this woman looks wholesome. She's most interested in enhancing her natural beauty. When it gets down to the product level of breast implants and facial treatments, it's informative in tone, it's not overpromising, and it's consistent with the mindset of someone who might be somewhat like Katie Couric. We then continued that personalization across the entire marketing mix. You're able to buy media which has higher incidences of the Katie Couric or the Samantha Jones. You're able to build an entire user experience. In fact, we built a morphing tool that allowed us to show women what they would actually look like by uploading a photo and customizing what post-surgical appearance might look like. And then marched across a consistent set of consumer communications to enable deeper and deeper customer engagement. So you may ask, well, that's all kind of cool, but what happened? Did it really work? And in fact, time after time after time, when you get to this level of consumer insight, you get dramatically better marketing results that actually fundamentally change the economics of entire companies or industries. So you can see the consumer response to the emails was significantly higher. You can see that, in fact, we were able to drive ROI and all of the subcomponents of that dramatically by about 250%. So I share this story with you not to boast, but to provide a promise out there that says there actually is a way to crack open the complexity of the healthcare decision-making process such that you can fundamentally change the economics of how commercialization works. So we pull back to this question, and in fact, we discover that healthcare is actually far more complex than the first view of it. Because not only do we have all these nodes that we have to deal with, but we have to deal with those nodes across a panoply of personalities. And you have to get each element of the entire ecosystem aligned to optimize what becomes the patient experience that drives patient engagement. So I want to leave you with a little bit of a roadmap on how you might do this. It is hard. It takes a long time. There are frustrating moments when you think you've got it and then you run a test and discover that you actually haven't figured it out. But there is a path if you devote the strategy, the manpower, and the intestinal fortitude to stick with it to actually get to this level of consumer insight to ultimately personalize the commercialization process. So I would propose that the way to get started is to build a set of foundational insights. This just happens to be one way to characterize the patient. But the most important thing is to go past that unidimensional view, the Betty Draper view of demographics, because they really are not the basis of personalization. The next step is to begin to set up a very disciplined and data-driven test and learn process. And a lot of people look at this step and they say, yeah, we do A/B testing. This is not A/B testing. This is going deep into understanding what makes Samantha Jones tick and actually having the entire website change shape based on how she makes decisions, how she takes on information, and how she might move from consideration to ultimately making an appointment to see a physician. And then ultimately building an entire platform, an entire company around progressively deeper insights on personal motivation. And I'll give you an example from a completely different industry that accomplished this and fundamentally changed the basis of competition in that industry. And that was Capital One. Capital One started as a tiny little regional bank called Signet Bank in Virginia. And they figured out that they could model something that looks a lot like Y-based marketing. And over the successive 15 years, basically took about 70% of all the credit card holders away, credit card consumers, away from the big banks, and actually served them better because they created a better personalized experience based on data. They ran a few tests, then thousands of tests, and today literally hundreds of thousands to millions of tests of constantly trying to understand how to optimize product market fit and ultimately personalization. And so my dream for what we all do here in the health tech industry is that we will take that same path in a far more complex environment and ultimately deliver the consumer into the middle of the Copernican structure. Thank you.